Hey, well, let me tell you a little story about why we wrote this paper. It started with about a year and a half ago. I formed this team, and when we started our term, we thought, why don't we get all of the details and slides and information from all of the past editors and associate editors in terms of how they presented AMR and how they did workshops. So we gathered all of this information and we tried to consolidate it. And Greg was very instrumental in taking all of this and putting it together. And we realized that there were lots of pieces of like, how do you write an introduction, or how do you come up with a great title, or how do you do these various things? But there was nothing that consolidated it all. And at the time that we were doing this, Greg was doing a workshop for his PhD students. So he kind of pilot tested our huge slide deck that we put together, consolidating everything. It had hundreds and hundreds of slides. And as he did this, he put together a few exercises that he asked the students to work on to really kind of get at some of the advice that the previous associate editors and editors had come up with. And so we thought, well, this is a great opportunity to maybe try and have exercises for every part of the paper. And so we put them together and we started doing this in our idea development workshops, which we've done many of them online in a virtual format. And whenever we did it, the respondents or the participants were so grateful for having had access to the exercises and thinking through them. And as part of my vision for this team, it was to be intentionally inclusive. And so that meant we're reaching many people through these virtual workshops, but maybe there was more we could do. And so we decided to use the platform of From the Editor section in the journal to actually write this paper where we could describe the exercises and talk about why they're valuable. And so that's the long story about how we came up with this idea and this article, and Greg was instrumental in all of it.
Thanks, Sherry. So I think there's a few important things to just note about what we've got in this article, how you can use it, and what relevance it might play in your own journey to potentially write theory, either for the front end of an empirical paper, or hopefully also for a fully conceptual paper that you might consider submitting to AMR. What we've got in this set of, in this editorial is really a collection of other valuable editorials, articles, perspectives that we've curated and brought together into something that's understandable, usable, and hopefully very practical. So all we've done is translate prior editorials and articles into what is largely practical exercises that transition you from just reading and thinking about what you should do or what you could do to move your conceptual ideas forward into actually doing something. And so part of the value of this editorial and of the exercises that are embedded in it is doing something, taking your ideas and beginning to put ideas down on paper in an organized kind of way that helps you then conceptualize and understand what you're trying to do and move it forward. And so the practical exercises require your agency, require your responsiveness, require you to sit down and actually do something if you're going to generate any value from them. So what we land up with are basically a set of sort of exercises that you can take time to do to respond to the prompts, write down your ideas, refine them, go back to exercises and rework what you've done in order to create the foundation or the basis to get started on a conceptual paper. You're not going to finish a full AMR manuscript just by completing these exercises. All it's going to do is get you maybe 20% of the way there, but it's going to be the right 20% to start with. It's going to create a solid foundation for then starting to elaborate on your ideas, connect them in interesting ways, convey them in the most appropriate ways. So there's still, even if you do, follow what we've said to the T and try and be quite conscientious in doing all of it, it's going to get you a certain portion of the way there that you then going to have to do additional work in order to get to a full manuscript draft that you can then ship around and ultimately submit. And we'll talk a little bit about what should happen post having done these exercises a little later in this session. But one of the useful sort of ways of thinking about this is that you're creating the right kind of solid foundation of which to build a conceptual paper, getting some of the basics right first, organizing your thoughts initially. And ultimately, one of the big things I've come to appreciate and use as a sort of metaphor for what we do in theory development and theorizing is that writing a conceptual paper and developing theory is really a craft. And so I want you to focus in and hone on that term a little bit. There's not one correct way of doing it. There are multiple correct ways or multiple ways of achieving an interesting outcome. There are multiple outcomes that could be achieved that you could go to. There's not one formula for what a conceptual paper looks like. But if you think about any kind of craft, so be it pottery or glass blowing or calligraphy or welding, any of those kind of crafts have got these sort of fundamental skills or fundamental elements that one needs to get right before you start getting too smart or clever or elaborate in what you're trying to do. If you are doing pottery and you start by constructing the most weird bowl out there, it's probably going to fall apart. You need to get the basics of building that bowl right first before you start to add on any kind of elaborate nuance. And so that's what we're articulating here are some of those basics that you need to get right first before you begin adding on any nuance. And if you can think about the notion of theory development and crafting theory as a craft, then you can think about it as something that you can get better over time. The more you practice, the better you're going to get. And getting these fundamentals right is going to set you up with the appropriate foundation of which to then do more elaborate things and of which to then create more novel and nuanced and interesting theories down the line. But you've got to get these fundamentals right in order to be able to do that. So what we're going to do here is that now talk you through what some of those fundamentals are and how you can sort of practically get begin to develop them.
Okay. I think we skipped a slide.
Oh, we have. Yeah. There we go.
There we go. And also, I want to reiterate what Greg said about this being a craft. So many times we get in the hallways of conferences when we used to have them in person and all those things, we would get the question like, I have an idea, but how do I get started? And sometimes the getting started is the really hard part. So the other thing that's really nice about the set of exercises, I think that we'll go through today, is that they help you get started. They help you be able to think through what you're trying to do and give you a framework for building. So to get back to these slides, think about a paper. When you read a paper, you start with the abstract, and then if you're interested, you continue on, right? You read the introduction, and for a conceptual paper, then you'll read the theoretical background foundations, the theory development, and then you'll reach the discussion and conclusion. So even though you go through steps 1 through 5 in the way that you read it, that's not the way that you generally tend to write it. Because if you were to start from an abstract, by the time you got to the discussion and conclusion, it would probably be on something completely different. So where we really want you to focus is that we're going to start you by getting you to think about like number 3, theoretical background and foundations, which would then help you to understand the theory development. And then we work backwards and put in some of those other pieces. So As you think about this set of exercises, we have 7 of them. We've put them in an order in which we think makes a lot of sense for how we have generally developed theory ourselves, but you may use them in whatever order makes sense to you. And so this isn't you have to do it in this order or it won't work. It will work for you to use them in the way that it makes most sense for you. So Greg, back to you.
Cool, thank you, Sherry. So the starting point here is to start with the big picture. And the big picture of writing a conceptual paper, what are you ultimately trying to do? In the end, at AMR and at any other journal taking purely conceptual papers, the critical element is it making a theoretical contribution? And so that's ultimately what you're trying to achieve. But there are a variety of different paths that you can take, broad sort of paths or categories that you can employ in order to make a theoretical contribution. And for the longest time, I didn't even appreciate that there were these different ways and these different nuanced perspectives that one can take in trying to make a theoretical contribution. And once I was able to distill these and actually saw some of these ideas in prior slides, as Sherry had mentioned, of associate editors and so on, all of a sudden, it became clearer to me how a conceptual paper can contribute, and it became easier for me to categorize my own work and then to categorize the work of others as it came across my desk as an associate editor. And these primary paths of contribution are actually quite clearly specified in the aims of the Academy of Management Review, the sort of statement that states what the journal is set out to achieve. However, most of us as researchers don't disentangle that and pay a whole lot of attention to that. We sort of read it quite broadly and say, oh, we need to make a theoretical contribution. So the question is, how can you do that? Well, the one obvious one is you go about developing a whole new theory. Now, that's a fairly big task to say, I'm going to develop some kind of theoretical perspective or set of theoretical understanding that really is novel, new, and stands alone and on its own. And so in essence, there's actually very few papers in AMR that truly develop a completely new theory. There might be a few, but they're few and far between because there's quite a high bar to clear in terms of doing that. And so much more common is challenging some kind of existing theoretical perspective, where you can take something that people have largely taken for granted or begin to assume is the way things are, and offering some kind of twist on that. Maybe there's a contingency or a boundary condition under which that theory no longer applies, or there's a set of factors that cause it to operate in the opposite direction, a set of relationships to operate in the opposite direction from what one's seen before. So it's quite common, in fact, for a paper to be set up that the conversation in the past has been this. However, if one suddenly factors in another perspective or a new phenomenon or something else that's come to light, then that doesn't necessarily hold, or some aspect of that theory is going to fall apart and change in its nature. So the second is to significantly challenge or enhance. So create greater or clearer specification of that already exists. Then the third is to take a set of divergent kind of ideas, often from different domains or different landscapes, and begin to integrate them into in a novel and interesting way. So, I mean, one of the examples that's sort of in top of mind for me in this regard is what Suchman did with legitimacy in 1995, one of the most highly cited AMR papers. He basically took the strategic perspective and the institutional perspective of legitimacy and said, what happens when we bring them together? Bringing together sort of what had been spoken about from a legitimacy standpoint, largely in an organizational strategy setting, and then compared and integrated the traditional sort of sociological and institutional perspective and brought those two together. And so synthesized ideas that were somewhat related, but had been happening as separate conversations, and allowed new perspectives to emerge as a result of doing that. And then the fourth is crafting ways to improve the process of theory development. So we've recently had a special issue, which was alluded to quite a lot last week in the discussion, in this discussion, where there was a paper on abduction, and abduction as a mechanism for creating new theory. And so that is a paper which articulates or lays out a way to improve what we're trying to do in theory development. And we've got a number of papers that tap into both sort of pure deductive theory development, abductive theory development, inductive theory development. If you go back to Kathy Eisenhardt's 1989 paper, which I think is the most cited AMR paper. So those papers are also not as common, but if they do get in, they can often be highly impactful and influential because they empower other people to do other things. So one of the starting point exercise here is to step back and say, what am I really trying to do in the paper that I'm examining or that I'm trying to develop and ultimately trying to build out? And you might not be clear on this at the point that you start. It's perfectly feasible or potential that you're not 100% clear on, am I trying to develop new theory? Am I trying to enhance existing theory? Am I synthesizing divergent ideas? You could be sort of unclear on which of those you're going to take, but thinking about it, trying to understand what you're trying to do and creating in your mind a conception that that's what you're trying to do is very, very helpful. And what's even more helpful, or what, at least for me personally, what I found incredibly valuable in particular in writing theory papers, but in fact any paper, is once I've understood the big picture of what I'm trying to do, is to say, well, who else has done that pretty well? So if I go back to the examples I've just raised and I say, I think I'm trying to synthesize divergent ideas or literatures into a fresh new perspective. And I can go back and say, well, Suchman did that really, really well in 1995. Let me look a little bit more carefully at his paper as an exemplar of which to build my own ideas. And going out and finding 2, maybe 3 other papers that potentially and very likely don't come from the theoretical perspective that you're adopting or pursuing. They've tried to achieve the same thing, but potentially in another area, and have hopefully been well received and are sort of viewed as valuable papers, and utilizing those as exemplars. Now, this idea of using an exemplar as a way of initially sort of getting your ideas down and then understanding what you're trying to do is an idea that I've borrowed from Anne Huff's book on writing for scholarly publication. An outstanding book. And one of the main takeaways from that book is that we're never trying to completely reinvent the wheel in writing a paper. We're writing for an audience that understands certain conventions and the way things are framed and conveyed. And if we can tap into what other people have done and use at least some of their ideas in our constructing of new ideas, we can end up doing a more robust and a better job. And it facilitates us breaking through boundaries and barriers as we're trying to develop our own ideas. So the second part of this exercise says, once you think you've understood what broad direction you're trying to take for your paper, go out and find other papers from the journal for which you're writing, because there are invariably conventions attached to certain journals about the length of a paper and about the way things are structured and sort of the overarching flow that Sherry alluded to earlier. So go and find other published papers from the journal in which you're trying to publish that seem to have had an impact and are trying to do something similar to what you're trying to do. And my practice then is to print those out, to go through them quite carefully and almost to disentangle or unpack what they've done in each paragraph, and then to set that aside next to me while I'm trying to write. And so one of the things I do in unpacking those paragraphs is write down the name of the exemplar paper, which we've got in the bottom over here, and then identify key things that that author has done that I think have helped that paper. And so relevant elements, lessons, insights, conventions that they've employed that I think might be valuable for me as I go forward. And so it's creating this foundation of, this is the big picture of what I'm trying to do. These are other papers that have done the same thing pretty effectively, and I'm going to learn from them before I dive down into the weeds of what I'm trying to do. So that's exercise number one. Although it's only a few little blocks of writing here, it can take quite a lot of time to do it well, to do it effectively, and to untangle those exemplar papers that are really going to allow you to feel like you're empowered and making progress in writing your conceptual paper. Any questions on this as an exercise or on aspects of what we've said thus far, just in terms of clarifying or helping you understand what you might be trying to do in this initial exercise?
Yeah, if people have any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand and then we'll call you by name. Carolyn? I need to unmute yourself, please.
Good morning. It may be helpful to talk just a bit briefly about how to identify the exemplar manuscripts so that you don't waste time with others that are credible, of course, but don't get you where you want to go.
Yeah, so I mean, I've got my way of doing it is to look at highly cited papers.
Okay.
So I often go to on the AMR website, you can go to the highly cited papers, and then if you click on that, it will take you to a longer list of highly cited papers, and almost work my way through there and try and identify ones that I recognize as having tried to do the same thing as I've done. So that's one mechanism, is looking for other highly cited papers. And typically, if I'm trying to find 2 or 3 exemplars, I'm trying to find one that, at least one that is been out and is established and gotten some traction, and then one that's more recent. And so finding the one that's more recent can be a little bit more tricky. But one of the things I highly recommend to anyone who wants to publish in AMR is you need to be reading AMR. You need to be picking it up every issue and understanding what's in there and what's being published that could be impacting your work. And if you get into that practice, then it suddenly becomes a lot easier to be able to identify exemplar articles at the point that you need to do so. So the second major recommendation is, if you want to publish in AMR, read AMR fairly regularly, and it becomes a lot easier not only to find the exemplar articles, but also to consciously build off that work and those conversations that are happening there. So those are the 2 things that have helped me.
I would like to just add one other thing as well, which is, as you're reading AMR articles or as you come across things that you're citing in your work, like, this is where it's a good idea for you to keep track of those articles that you think do a really good job at something. So it may not even be that they do a great job at, you don't like everything they've done, but maybe you really like the way they structured their introduction, or maybe you really like the way they structured their discussion. And just keeping track of those things will give you some insight when you then come to this type of exercise and say, how do I want to kind of not copy, but like take advantage of what you've learned from this particular type of example.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Tony?
Yes. Hi. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Why are they so? This is a question from someone who's trying to get published, but the question is, why are there so few outlets for theory papers? I certainly wanted to get published in AMR, but why are there so few outlets for theory papers?
So I'll make two comments on that, Tony. I mean, one is just really sort of supply demand, and so we also don't want too many different theories out there. Like you can overdo it on theory and theory proliferation, and it just goes crazy, and no one can keep track of what's going on. So I guess on the one hand, there's sort of slightly less demand for a whole lot of new theory papers out there, whereas you can get 8, 9, 10 empirical papers off a single theory paper, and they sort of interface with each other. So that would be one factor. But then the second, I guess, more positive factor is that there are, we often, at least this was the mindset that was developed when I was a PhD student, was, oh, it's AMR or bust, which is just not the case. I'm an entrepreneurship scholar. I've published theory papers in JBV, SEJ, and ETP. Oh, I've got one coming out in ETP. And so those are other outlets that I've gone to. In some cases, the paper might have been rejected at AMR. In other cases, I've just chosen to go there first. At a broader level, JMS will publish conceptual papers. Org Theory is set up to publish conceptual papers. It's a newer journal, but very, very well run and wonderful experience there. So the other thing I would say, most journals have become more open to it over time, because conceptual papers do tend to be well cited and embraced by the audience, their audiences. And there are certain new journals emerging that are doing it. So the main thing I would echo, the main sentiment I would encourage you to think about there is, it's not AMR or bust. There are actually lots of different alternatives, and you've just got to be a little bit more deliberate about exploring what those might be.
I'd also like to add that Journal of Management has recently started accepting conceptual papers. The Journal of Applied Psychology does conceptual integration papers, organizational science. So I do think, as Greg said, that many more journals are being open to the idea that this is a really important thing to publish. So you will see more opportunities for that.
Thank you. Just one follow-up, because I submitted a paper to a journal that was rejected, and one of the comments was, you need to decide whether you're writing an empirical paper or a theory paper. And I decided, okay, I want to go the theory route and so I've been reading lots of AMR and all of your editorials on trying to get published, to publish a theory paper. So thank you for your comments, and thank you for hosting this
Welcome. Thank you.
event.
Thank you, Tony. Cardullo? No. I think there was Corvis, I think had a hand raised earlier.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Hi there. My question is just a clarification question in relation to the contrast and differences between enhancement and divergent ideas. If you can explore that a little bit more in detail. The reason why I'm saying is that I'm exploring a theory paper that is a multidisciplinary theory one. So I just want to understand the differences between those 2 points.
So I'll make 2 comments here. The first comment is, don't worry too much about if you are feel like you're getting bleed over from one category to another. That's not the end of the world. As long as you understand you're getting that bleed over. These categories are not mutually exclusive. And so it is very possible to say, well, I'm enhancing existing theory, but I'm doing it by integrating ideas from two different theories. So I'm getting bleed over between 2 and 3. Nothing wrong with that at all, as long as you're conscious and you recognize you're doing it. But in order to just say, enhancing existing theory is often about either exploring something new that adds to an existing theory. So it might be something that you're integrating from elsewhere, as you've described, from another literature. And you say, by bringing in this idea of identity into the organization's literature, we get a new perspective. So you've enhanced some organizational theory through the idea of identity from individual domain. And so that it's perfectly possible that that could happen.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Much appreciated.
Okay, shall we move on?
Let's go. Okay, wonderful. So the second exercise that we suggest that you work on is actually very well described by McAdock, Burton, and Barney in their 2018 paper in Strategic Management Journal. Now, this paper was written, all of the examples in it are for strategy scholars, but yet it can be, it's really applicable to anyone, right? These ideas in terms about theory. The other thing is these ideas could be used if you're just thinking about, what about the theory piece of an empirical paper? These questions are just as important as if you're doing a completely conceptual paper. So they, McAdock, Burton, and Barney, they laid out 8 parts that they say are required in order to talk about a theory. So the first that they talk about is a research question, right? Like, what is the one main thing that you're trying to get your head around and trying to answer? The second part is a mode of theorizing. So how are you going to actually engage in this theorizing? Is it deductive, inductive, abductive? Is it static? Is it dynamic, right? There's lots of different approaches in terms of how you want to engage in the theorizing. The level of analysis, this is who. Are you at the individual level? Are you at the team level? Are you at the organizational level, societal level, community level? Is it multi-level, right? So just thinking about who is it that you're really trying to understand and target with your theory. A fourth part is about the phenomena. Where do you see this thing taking place, right? Where is this theory make sense, and that where does this theory exist such that it provides some insight? A fifth part is the causal mechanism. And now this is a super important part. And we often see in the papers and the submissions that we get, like there'll be pieces of these other parts that are listed on this slide, but that causal mechanism of why does something happen? Why does something connect other pieces? Sometimes is missing. And that's really a lot of times where the theorizing comes in. So it's important not to forget about that causal mechanism. A set of constructs or variables, the what is it that's actually what you're talking about? And then the set of boundary conditions. It's not likely that the theory that you're coming up with or developing is true in all cases. So what are those situations and when it is not true, right? Or what are those situations in which it is true, where you find it? And then finally, the set of outputs. So these can be the explanations, predictions, or prescriptions. And this is really getting at, like, why is this really important? Now that you've explained to us this theory, why is it, how is it that we could take it and now understand something in a more generalizable sense? Let's go on to the next. Maybe. Can we go? I think, there we go. Perfect. So the exercise 2 basically asks you to write a sentence or two for each of the following statements. So the first one would be the research question I seek to address is blank. At the very least, have this idea down, right? You're trying to The primary modes of theorizing I will adopt are, fill in the blank. And again, as Greg said in the earlier exercise, as you do this, you may say, I'm not quite sure what mode of theorizing I'm going to do yet. I'm still thinking, I have this research question. I'm trying to figure out how best to approach it. And that's okay, right? So when you're starting with this idea, you're filling in as much as you can with the understanding that you're probably going to have to go back many times and rewrite or fill in the blanks or rethink some aspects. So you have the primary level of analysis and then the phenomena that you're interested in. Sometimes you may not be interested in a specific phenomena. You're interested in a theory or extending the theory, and that's okay too. Sometimes it's very phenomena driven, what you're interested in. So you'll have something very precise to put here, but maybe not so much in some of the other areas. The primary causal mechanism, right? The next one is the core constructs. And so if you have the core constructs, what connects those core constructs? So say you're interested in how, I don't know, demographic diversity impacts performance. Those constructs, but what is linking them? If you're saying there's an impact or a positive impact, then what is the causal mechanism? I'm sorry if can people hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I heard my internet was unstable for a second, so I apologize. The causal mechanism is really your underlying explanation for the core constructs or variables and connecting them. And finally, the boundary conditions are when it may or may not hold the theory that you're trying to propose. And then finally, the outputs of my theorizing. Greg, if my voice is cracking, you can take over some of this.
So just a few comments on this exercise quickly. It is a very powerful exercise if you do it properly. And a few things about doing it properly and executing on it and putting your best foot forward and effort forward. Number one is it's really valuable to print out that MacAdoc article and to have it next to you and to almost read what they say about the research question, about the modes of theorizing, about the phenomena, about the causal mechanisms, about boundary conditions, each of those sections before you fill this out, and to try and connect the logic of what they've got in that article with what you do here. And this then becomes your theoretical apparatus. It's like the things you can draw from to then construct a much more elaborate theory. And what you've got are a really great set of apparatus or tools of which to build, and you haven't left any out as you start to think about writing and connecting them in a more cohesive way. So I was going to pull this down from above my desk because I keep, you can't really see it, but I keep the printout from their paper above my desk to continually remind myself that these are the theoretical apparatus that are valuable. And so every time I've done this with students, with junior faculty, with others, and they do it properly, then you see lights go on and people get excited about what they're trying to do. But it takes effort. It's not just a quick little, oh, I think I know my research question, I'll sort of jot it down in an informal way. You've actually got to be quite conscientious about what you're doing.
I would definitely second that. And Ibrat put it in the chat, I think, a recording with Professor MacAdoc about this. And so if you don't want to read everything that they have written, you can also hear it. But it's also, it's wonderful in order to have that level of detail to understand and what Greg is talking about in terms of writing down your statements for this exercise.
Abdullah?
I think you're muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering whether you can say a little bit about specifying causal mechanisms in a theory paper. What tips and strategies do you suggest?
I'm sorry, what types of what do we suggest?
What tips and strategies do you suggest for really specifying a tenable a causal mechanism in a theory paper?
Oftentimes that causal mechanism is the basis of the theory that you're talking about. So in terms of the strategies, I think as you do the rest of the exercises and really think about what you're trying to provide in the way of conceptualizing, that your description of that causal mechanism is going to be your contribution.
So invariably, a theory conveys that something causes or is related to something else. Some kind of outcome is caused by or is generated by something else. This something else, the independent variable or independent aspect causes something that's dependent on that. And it's what's causing that, what's actually going on that creates or allows that independent thing to be related to that dependent thing. And so is it a matter of identity? Is it a matter of homophily? Is it a matter of, like, what's the underlying cause for that thing? You've got these two things that are potentially related, but what's driving that relationship? What's underpinning it? If you look at the sort of cogs underneath all of that, that's the question you need to ask yourself there. So if you go back to this exercise, you've got these core constructs and variables that are invariably related in some way, but they don't focus on just the relationship. They say, what is the causal mechanism of that relationship? Because that's what needs to be front and center in the theory, not just the fact that they're related. One of the mistakes I see in a lot of theory papers is these prior researchers found that identity is related to firm performance, or social, corporate social responsibility is related to firm performance. Therefore, I'm theorizing that. That doesn't help us. We need to understand if you want to theorize it, what's the cause, what's the underlying factor that connects social responsibility or corporate social responsibility activities to that performance. How do those activities actually impact the performance variables you're interested in? What's driving that? So that's getting at the causal mechanism. And it's a great question because it's probably the weakest aspect of most theorizing efforts and the thing that can push you over the line if you get it right.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. A quick follow-up question is, because we will have to stop at causality at some point, because we cannot go on asking what causes then homophily and what causes homophily that causes homophily. We have to stop somewhere, and then, so do you consider that stopping points to be the boundary conditions, or how do we, like, where do we stop? Like, what is the reasonable point of stopping there? Thank you.
It's another great question. I would say, where you want to stop is, well, you need to think about your contribution, which is what are you adding that's new? So if someone has already said that homophily is the reason that's driving this, then you may want to get a little bit deeper in terms of, are there different types or different aspects of homophily that say really matter in this particular relationship, and that way you're giving us a better understanding of what's underlying that, right? So I do think that it's a judgment call on the authors in terms of saying, this is where my contribution is, and this is where my contribution is not. Like, that's already been established in the literature.
Thank you.
Sure. Do you have another question?
Irania?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Professor Thatcher and Professor Fisher. I have a question. So when you explore a particular causal mechanism, is it necessary that the key constructs, well, because there can be several, but I guess the key construct that you theorize, the causal mechanism, should the construct involved in the causal mechanism be part of the core constructs? in the model, when you have the independent and dependent variable. So how necessary is it to have that mediating variable versus having the independent and dependent variable and having the causal mechanism as a theory that you describe and connect?
So the more important aspect is to have it as something that you describe and use in order to explain the connection. It is an option to in some way include it in any visual description that you have of what's going on. Sometimes you might include it as a box with, as mediator with dotted arrows and dotted lines around it or something, or just embedded in there as the thing that's driving it. But the thing that you're going to be critically assessed on is, have you invoked it and described it in leading up to the explanation of that relationship? And it may or may not, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer as to whether it needs to appear in a visual description or a visual representation of what you're saying. That's sort of a judgment call. And does it make the figure look too busy and too chaotic, or does it actually add and reinforce key ideas? So the critical thing is so this is setting you up to actually write the text and the explanation of that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Natalie?
Hi, so I have a question about sort of the mode or maybe the output of theorizing. So I saw in the 2021 letter from the editors that there's a section, don't evangelize. But I have a question about critical theory. So I did not set out to write a critical theory, but I'm realizing that a big part of my theory sort of uncovers ways that organizations contribute to discrimination and inequality and injustice. And I'm having trouble figuring out how to talk about that. Like, do I save that for just like a practical implications paragraph at the end, or is that something that I can address earlier in the paper?
Well, I'll take a first crack at it and then Greg can jump in. So I believe you can address it earlier in the paper, but I do think it's important. Like, one of the things that we see is just sometimes submissions that only criticize, right? Without kind of a path forward. It's very easy to be critical of theories that have come before, but what is that allows us to move forward into understanding how things work? So if it's just going to say, well, this is what I've uncovered and these are all the horrible things that it has done, then it probably doesn't add much value to our understanding. But now that we know what you've told us, how can you now use that as a way for developing your own understanding of what's happening, your own understanding of the theory that's moving us forward?
I also think there's potentially a way that you can capture your outcome variable and capture your whatever that outcome is that you're interested in, without, at least up front in the paper, being too judgmental around whether that's right or wrong. You're just specifying that as the outcome. And then in the practical implications section saying, for firms that are trying to reduce discrimination or trying to increase diversity or trying to mitigate immoral behavior, this is what this theory would imply. So that's sort of another way of doing it, is that you sort of introduce whatever it is that you're describing in a pretty non-judgmental kind of direct way, and then bring in the implication and prescription in later in the paper, based on the fact that thing can be inferred as undesirable in some kind of way.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, we'll take one more and then we'll need to move on. So, Dewaka?
Good evening, sir. I just want to understand the different outputs of theorizing. So what all can be the theoretical contributions from my theory paper?
Yeah, so your outputs can be things like propositions, right? So the proposition could be the description of how your theory explains the relationships between variables. It could be predictions about what might happen based on some process theorizing that you engage in. There's a lot of different outputs, and this is where I think that depending on the journal that you're writing for, you might actually come up with a different set of outputs. For AMR, it's very important that you have some theoretical implication section. It's very important that you talk about the practical implications. And so we do want to hear, in terms of your theorizing, what those outcomes might look like.
Thanks.
Yeah, so, and I think those outcomes will be dependent on something we'll address a little bit later on, which is what is the type of theorizing that you're engaging in? Is it more process or narrative driven? Is it more propositional? And so that'll become a little bit more concrete based on that later exercise. And that brings us back to the point that often you will learn something through one of the follow-on exercises that impacts what you've put into this worksheet. And so there's this opportunity or need to cycle back. Like you might have put something in here around the causal mechanism, and then you get into thinking about or conceptualizing your theory in a visual format and recognize, oh, I'm actually thinking about another causal mechanism, meaning you need to come back and revisit this if you want to keep things intact. So we will address that sort of mode of theorizing a little bit later on. Okay, let's move on. The third exercise is thinking now about that theoretical background section of the paper. Theoretical background section is sort of establishing the theories off which you are building and layering on top of and potentially going to contribute back to. So the literature in which you're going to situate your theorizing. In terms of writing a conceptual paper, we're not trying to do that in a pure vacuum where you're bringing in, you're not building off anything else. You're doing it within the context of what's been said before, what's been sort of put forth in the literature before, and bringing your reader up to speed on those things so that you can add to them, so that you can layer on top of them. And so it's important to think about which literatures am I building off? What are the sort of core literatures I'm building off? And to try and get the number of those literatures or prior theoretical ideas right. If there's no theory or very, very little of which you're building before, then you land up in a space where you've really got not too much to build on. But if you're invoking 8, 9 different theoretical ideas and trying to layer on each of them, then you get what we think of as a Frankenstein paper, which has just got too much going on and no one can make any sense of it. So the idea is to think which 2, 3, maybe 4 literatures am I building on, and even 4 would be quite a lot. And to just have a document for yourself what those might be and what key ideas from those literatures are you going to leverage and utilize in your own theorizing. So what am I going to need to specify up front so that I'm bringing my reader on board with what's already been said, such that I can layer on top of that and use those ideas in my own theorizing. So if you think back to doing a dissertation, it's a little bit like the literature review for your dissertation, but it's done in a much more condensed way, a much more targeted way, based on the theoretical contribution you want to make. Many dissertation literature reviews go on for dozens and dozens of pages. Here we're talking about condensing and conveying the theory background to what you're doing in a fairly tight sort of 6, 7 pages worth, such that you can build on top of that. And so what this exercise forces you to do is think about what are the foundational literatures of which I'm building? What are the 2, 3, maybe 4 critical references in those literatures? And what are the key insights I can grasp from that literature that are going to impact, that I'm going to need to convey, because they're going to impact my theory development when I get into that in the next section. So it's like an outline or an initial draft outline of what's going to go into your theory development section. And you might want to, if you're doing this with co-authors, you definitely want to check in with your co-authors that they agree that these are the foundational literatures of which you're working and that you're tapping into the right critical references. But it just creates the basis of which to say, okay, I've organized my thoughts. Now it's going to give me some certainty and in terms of actually writing my theoretical background section.
I'd also like to say on this particular exercise, for many of the papers that don't fare very well at AMR, it's because too much time is spent on this section of theoretical background and without a clear sense of the literature that you're tapping into. So for example, if I were interested in something around relationship conflict, but I started to write, or I put here that I was reviewing all of the conflict literature, then I'm talking about something that's way too big and really doesn't give me the reference that I need to be able to make my arguments around relationship conflict. And so knowing your key constructs that we talked about earlier can really help you in terms of understanding which foundational literatures that you might need to focus on.
And generally, it's preferable to go deeper and narrower here rather than try and cover too much. So yes, focus in on what's really important for what you're gonna build in the next section and go deeper into that. Offer us a little bit more detail on that in this condensed space. And remember, by the time you hit the end of this section in your paper, you shouldn't be over halfway through the paper. It should be substantially less than halfway. So that includes your introduction plus this section. You're talking about getting up to 12 pages in total at the most. So this has got to be tight and condensed, and we still want to get some depth around the key ideas you're going to build on. Hence, you need to be quite selective in terms of what are the ideas that I'm going to build on. Sophie.
Hi, thank you for the session. Firstly, I have a question regarding this because this is what I argue with my supervisor about. Is it a standard that every theoretical paper has one section only dedicated to the theoretical background? Is it also okay to already mingle or to apply the theory on the phenomenon that I'm interested in? So I'm trying to do phenomenon-based theorizing. So the second paper that was recommended for the session. And my supervisor, he hates if I just very generally talk about the theory that I'm going to use and to enhance. So maybe just some feedback from your side would be helpful.
So I think the thing I would say is if you are, if it's a purely conceptual paper, you do need to have that depth and foundation of which to work. And hence being too general, too vague, or maybe even thinking about integrating it with the introduction is probably not going to play that well. This section then becomes quite important. However, if you are doing a qualitative paper, which is largely inductive, the Kathy Eisenhardt style, you can often get away with doing an extended introduction without a theory background paper, because then you're even more dependent on the phenomenon and on what you're inducting from that phenomenon to ultimately build your theory. You're not drawing much from other theories. But for the purpose of a purely conceptual paper, I would say this, even if you're doing phenomenon-based theorizing, this is somewhat necessary. It might be a little shorter because you want to get more into the phenomenon and maybe have a section in there about the phenomenon that sort of is sandwiched between the theory background and the theory development. But without this, a conceptual paper would seem really, really vague, thin, and difficult to interpret.
Okay, thank you. But just a follow-up question. So would you recommend to distinguish between theory and the phenomenon. So have one chapter on theory only without any reference to the phenomenon, and then one chapter on the phenomenon itself.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a good place to start. Over the review process, you might be pushed to maybe integrate them a little bit, but at least from a starting point, I would argue that's a good practice.
Okay, thank you. We have this on camera, and I will take this to my supervisor.
And I don't think you need, I mean, I wouldn't even think about it. You use the word chapter. These are just sections of a paper. Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Oh, Ibrat, you got one.
Yeah, just question on the literature. When you select, what's your view on whether you need to have a mix of theoretical papers or empirical papers, or a combination of those?
I mean, my basic view is whatever's determining the conversation at that point in time.
Yeah.
So it's largely what has determined the status quo. In some cases, like in the legitimacy area, the status quo is largely being determined by theoretical papers. Hence, the foundational literature for that piece is largely theoretical papers. It's Aldridge and Field and Navis and Glenn and so on. And there's a few empirical papers that get scattered in there, but in that theoretical section, theory background section, it's going to be sort of 70-30. Whereas in some other areas, the pattern, if you're having to build on the pattern literature, it's probably 80% empirical papers and maybe 20% theory there. So it's determined by whatever's created the conversation and the state of the art in the area on which you're going to build.
If I may, just one more question. I mean, I might be jumping ahead, but I'm maybe using my own example just to see how to connect those literatures. So I have, I suppose, basing my idea in the institutional work, but I also want to bring in sense making in order to explore the micro dynamics and to explain how institutional work unfolds over time. So perceptual view. In that sense, do I foreground institutional work in my theoretical background, or and therefore emphasize one literature over the other?
No, it seems to me that in that case, what you're trying to do is integrating in some sense. And if you're integrating, then we need to have a sense of both of the literatures that you're integrating. But because you have more than one literature, you will need to figure out a way to convey the conversation in both of them that doesn't take up too much space.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Good luck.
Cool. Let's move on. So the next is Sherry's going to talk us through some styles of theorizing.
Yes. So Joop Corneliussen, who's a great scholar, he was a previous associate editor of Academy Management Review, and he wrote a wonderful from the editor essay on the 3 common styles of theorizing. He also is the editor of Organization Theory, which we mentioned earlier. So he's very well endowed to be able to talk about this issue. And basically what he said is in this, from the editor, he went and looked at all of the articles published over the previous years and said, what do we see the most of? And basically what we see most in AMR are proposition-based style theorizing, narrative-based style theorizing, and typology-based style theorizing. So proposition-based style theorizing is when you have constructs of interest and you're basically talking about new cause-effect relationships, either with the constructs themselves or the mechanisms that are making the relationships. The narrative-based style is more of a process model, right? And it lays out a set of mechanisms, it talks about events, it talks about outcomes, it's often dynamic in nature. And the third approach is a specification of a typology. So it often talks about interrelationships between different dimensions to really flesh out how new constructs fit together. And the reason why this is important to know is because when readers pick up an AMR, they're very comfortable with these 3 styles of theorizing. So if you are new at this, or this is something you haven't done a lot of, then it's probably really helpful to start with something that readers are familiar with, because 1, you can find those exemplars that Greg talked about earlier of these different styles, and then be able to model yours along with these exemplars. And 2, it's just, again, the reader is familiar with it, and so they'll be more likely to be receptive to your ideas if they're written in a way or in a style that they're familiar with. I'm not going to go through all of the different things that Corneliusen did, because I suggest, like with the Barney Macadach paper that we talked about earlier, that you have this by your side and you read the original article, because not only does he describe the different styles, but he talks in depth about the recent examples of each of the styles. So someone earlier was asking about what are exemplar articles. There's some exemplar articles in here. There's also some exemplar articles in the FTE that we wrote, but it gives you a place to start with trying to find the right style that makes sense for you. And what I find interesting is a lot of people feel very comfortable with one certain style. I know all of my papers have ended up being proposition-based style. It's just how I think. I tend to think in terms of models and boxes and arrows, and it really helps me understand the issue or the thing that I'm trying to theorize about. Whereas others think about things very differently, and a narrative-based style may be much more comfortable for them. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? So the exercise that we ask you to do is 1, to read Corneliusen's original article. Again, he also has a short video on YouTube about this, so you can watch that as well. Identify your intended primary style of theorizing. Again, you may not know this right away until after you get more in depth in terms of understanding what you're really trying to do, and that's fine. But it doesn't hurt to have a starting place, right? And then to explain why you think that's your starting place in terms of your style. Something that can help you figure that out is to draw a figure or a table. And that's something that represents the essence of your theory. For me, this is almost where I start. I start at a model. I start out drawing something, cross it out, tear away the page, go through the next one, and iterations of models until I get something that makes a lot of sense. And then that helps me understand what literature I need to go to. It helps me understand, where I go from here. Now, hold on, before we go there. Number 3, it's way at the bottom, and it's in small print. Maybe you can't see it, but it says, share your figure table with someone else and see if they can grasp the essence of your theory from your drawing. Now, this may be a really scary ask, right? Like, I'm just thinking about my ideas. I don't know where I want to go with them yet. That's okay. Because one of the best ways to understand if what you're thinking makes sense is to see if someone who's looking at the same thing you are sees the same thing you do. Because if they don't, then you don't have it quite right. And maybe you need to change the labels on your constructs. Maybe you need to think differently about the mechanisms that are connecting things. Maybe the typology that you drew doesn't quite make sense for others. So what we suggest is you draw some kind of visual and ask someone, academic or not, what is it that you see? Don't tell them what you want them to see. Ask them what they see. And if they can correctly reiterate back to you what you've drawn, then you're on the right track.
Quick comment on this too. A propositional style is probably what you're going to end up drawing as boxes and arrows, like Sherry alluded to, and something's related to something else, and the proposition is sort of the explanation or the description of that arrow of how something's connected to something else. A narrative style or process-oriented theory is probably going to have a longer element to it and reflect what that process looks like that you're going to try and theorize. And a typology style is likely to be more of a table or 2x2 or 3x3 or something of that nature, with some kind of boxes representing different categories, at least as a starting point. And so I always keep that in my mind: boxes and arrows versus process diagram versus a table, depending on which of those two I'm trying to push forward. And so the next slide is just a few comments on actually using tables and figures in a paper and in the development of a paper.
Yes. So figures should be used to visually represent the text, right? Some people really learn by reading words. Some people learn by hearing things. And some people learn by looking at a visual. And so the visual is another way that you can show that you're theorizing and what you're trying to contribute. However, there are a lot of issues that we see as editors and associate editors with these visuals. So first, be sure that your model, construct, labels, relationships, whatever's in your process diagram, the labels on your tables, actually match your text. Sometimes I think what happens is people might be working on a version and then they decide to change maybe a construct label or something, but they don't go back to the visual and change it. Or if you have many co-authors, people might change things and others don't realize that. So make sure the construct labels and relationships match exactly what's in the text. If you do a propositional style, label your propositions in a figure. For example, here construct A leads to construct B through the mechanism of P1, right? Or P1 is going to be the description, the proposition where you're describing that relationship, and make sure again that it matches the text in the paper. And then finally, tables, if used, should add something new, not just repeat text, right? So you could say there are a number of different dimensions that have been used to describe a particular construct. And then you might highlight a couple of them, but you could say for a complete list of them, look at this table. So you've talked about it in the text, you've discussed the value of knowing it, but you don't spend a lot of time repeating everything that's in the table. The table augments what you're trying to do. So I think that's all that I have on this one. Oh, just again, one thing I do tend to find, sometimes the figures look like they come from a different paper entirely. Don't do that, okay? Make sure that the thing you're talking about in your visual actually matches what's in your text, because it's very confusing to the reviewers and to the associate editor if it actually doesn't line up straight.
Cool, thanks, Sherry. Yes.
Good question.
Yes, could you please just elaborate a bit more on the difference between proposition-based and narrative-based? Is the narrative just a bit more elaborate proposition type?
Usually a process-based does not have a set of propositions, and there are many things in the process diagram that are trying to be described or accomplished. And so it would be, I mean, basically your paper would almost be just a list of propositions in some ways if you try to list them all out and you're trying to describe a process. Greg, do you want to add something to that?
I mean, I think the basic is propositions get it down to cleaner, very specific relationships that one could theoretically then go, and if you could measure the constructs, test quite quickly, whereas process is richer, it's more detailed, and spells out how things happen over an extended sort of set of interactions, as opposed to distilling it down to a single interaction. And so you don't land up with these very clean propositions, you land up with this bigger overarching perspective of what's going on. So it's a slightly different sort of take on what's happening. And what can be very valuable is just go and look at that Cornelsen article and look at the examples that he's given, because there it becomes very clear quite quickly.
Mm-hmm. And then just as a quick follow-up, am I correct in thinking that usually the result of qualitative papers is this process models, right?
It could be. I mean, not necessarily. Kathy Eisenhardt does qualitative papers and often derives propositions from them, but many qualitative papers land up in a process model. So I wouldn't say it's one or the other. It can, and it could also be a typology that emerges from a qualitative paper. So it's not deterministic in that sense. Okay. Let's move on, because one of the critical pieces that you're ultimately going to do right for your paper is your introduction. Now, I can't emphasize this enough, that we are, me, Sherry, you, every reviewer who's going to read your paper has biases. And one of the biases we have is that we decide what we like and don't like very quickly. And so while we're reading this introduction, we're making these unconscious choices or decisions about what we think of this paper, and then almost trying to confirm that choice in the rest of the paper. Hence, we encourage you to do all the other work that we've described, theory background, theory development, and so on, so that by the time you get to writing the introduction, you actually have quite a good sense of what you're doing, because this is such an important piece of the puzzle. And because it's so important, we've had two separate editorial teams, each take a stab at trying to convey what is critical in an introduction and what can be really, really meaningful. And they are both incredibly valuable articles. So Don Lang and Mike Farr did from the editors called Sense and Structure, the core building blocks of an AMR article. And I commonly refer to that as the 5 C's article. And when you see the essence of the article, you'll understand why. And then Jay Barney, when he first took over as editor-in-chief at AMR, wrote a paper called Positioning a Theory Paper for Publication. And basically what this boils down to is, do you want to use the 5-paragraph introduction, which would be the 5 C's and the Farr and Lang and Farr, or do you want to use a shorter, more concise, even more direct introduction, the 3-paragraph introduction, which is what Barney proposes? Both can be done very, very effectively, and both offer you some sort of perspective or initial structure to writing a good introduction. So the 5 C's perspective, which was put forward in the Sense and Structure from the editors by Lang and Farr, basically says that a good introduction boils down to having about 5 paragraphs, and each of those 5 paragraphs have a single theme. And each of those themes are conveyed with a word starting with C. So paragraph 1 is the common ground of what's known in the space that you're going to say that you're going to make a contribution ultimately. So what is the conversation that is currently going on? You're not coming out and immediately saying, we're going to change the world. You're saying, this is what we know to this point in the domain of sense making, or in the domain of legitimacy, or in the whatever it is, that specific domain that you want to make a contribution to. So you're creating a common ground that you show you've understood the conversation to this point, and you can relay the most important aspects of that. But then paragraph 2 says, but there's a bit of a problem. There's something missing. There's something that doesn't make sense. There's some theoretical tension that is largely unresolved. And so we call that the complication paragraph. There's some puzzle that still needs to be resolved. And then paragraph 3 gets into that puzzle is important because there's some concern that emerges if we don't resolve this. We're missing something, or we're unable to resolve something. So, and then paragraph 4 begins to explain how we plan to resolve this in this paper. What are we doing in this paper in order to move forward? And then paragraph 5 distills the contributions that come from doing that. So it's sort of foreshadowing the key contributions of the paper. And I've found this to be an excellent starting point for thinking about an introduction. Often I'll end up with maybe 6 paragraphs, maybe 4, maybe I've combined complication and concern because it just makes sense to do so. But as a starting point to thinking about what needs to be in that introduction, and then ultimately in your abstract, which we'll get into in a moment, these 5 themes or elements are very, very valuable. And even if we go to the Barney format, he basically combines paragraph 2 and 3 and then 4 and 5 or as into a 3-paragraph introduction. So even if we're going to go and use Barney's 3-paragraph format, this is still a great place to start. And so the exercise here, and I really highly recommend again that you read from the editors. So what we're trying to do here is highlight the good work that our prior colleagues have done and alert you to them and point out how valuable they can be. And so the first one is this one. And here we've broken it down into 5 things and 5 prompts that can prompt you to jot down the key aspects of what's going to be in your introduction. So from prior research, we know that. And you write down, in essence, the most important aspects from prior research that relate to what you're going to be doing. Yet a complication comes about because of, and you can spell out what that might look like. This complication is of concern or is of importance or is relevant because, and then you can spell out what that looks, what needs to be said there. And then the course of action to address this concern entails, and then finally, this paper contributes to the literature by. Now, you might at this stage still be vague on those contributions, but getting that down in whatever format you think of it at this stage is important. Now, you could also use the Barney prompts, and he actually provides these prompts in his From the Editors, and you'll see he suggests a 3-paragraph introduction as opposed to 5. And his prompts for that 3-paragraph introduction are, this is the conversation I want to join. So same thing, common ground conversation, start with that. I've been listening to this conversation and these are the main elements. And so just showing that you've understood what's been said before and specifying that out so that you can integrate that into your introduction. However, the unresolved theoretical issue, and he hones in here on theoretical issue because we're writing a theory paper in this conversation is, and you specify what that is. And then the reasons for writing a theory paper include, so there you see the complication and concern sort of being combined into a single 2nd paragraph. And then the purpose of this paper is, and then the paper will pursue this purpose as follows. And so Barney's recommendation is you actually don't spell out in too much detail what the contribution is in the introduction. There's differences of opinion there. There's not necessarily a right or wrong, but this is a great starting point for actually thinking about your introduction. So I recommend that you dedicate a good chunk of time to your work on your introduction, and you can use either of these 2 exercises to do that. You don't need to use both, whichever you sort of relate to more, feels easier, feels more coherent to you. You can do this, and then from this begin to actually use whether it's this one or the other one as a basis to start to write your introduction. And so you'll see here, we've started in the middle section of the paper, then gone to the intro, and then we'll go to the discussion and finally to the abstract. Any questions on that?
Well, in the interest of time, maybe we should move forward and then we can take questions toward the end. Okay.
Perfect.
So as Greg mentioned, we started with the middle, then we went to the introduction, and then the discussion and conclusion. And I know we've heard a lot of people say, well, what else am I going to say in the discussion, right? I just spent all this time developing my theory. Now what do I say? Well, it's really important for AMR to leave room for a solid and thoroughly developed discussion section. So what should be in it? What should be in it is an understanding of how your theory impacts the field above and beyond what you just mentioned. So you may have discussed, something about, sorry, my battery just said it was going up. So you may have discussed something about, a social identity theory, and that's really important. But what does it mean for other theories? What does it mean for other literatures for you to have made this contribution, right? It should be something that we as readers go, aha, I never thought about it that way before. Now I can take what you've given me and actually apply it in possibly a different way than I had imagined. So it should not be an afterthought. And again, if you study some of the AMR papers, especially those that have received awards or are downloaded quite a bit, then you can get a sense of the value of this section and how authors in the past have really been able to show their knowledge of what they've developed and how it applies in other areas. It's also important to remember that last impressions matter too. So if you've done a great job with the introduction and the theory building, and the reader is just going along, and then all of a sudden your paper just ends, which I've seen, it's not a good last impression. And I say, well, so what? Come on, I want to be really excited by what you put forward and understand that it has an impact on the field going forward. Next slide, please. So the way that we've written this out here is usually there's a summary paragraph, right? Because that's a summary, this is what I did, and it gives you a nice segue into the rest of the discussion section. So the brief summary, and it should be obvious to you from all of the other work that you've done what this entails. Now for the theoretical contribution, think creatively. I used to dread doing this part, but over time, I've begun to love doing discussion sections because it gives me an opportunity to think, wow, now I've developed this. Where else does my idea matter? What other literatures, what other fields, what other phenomena does what I've done impact, right? So be creative, it gives you that opportunity to do so. We ask that you talk about practical contributions, but the extent to which you do so kind of depends on the theorizing that you do. It may be more or less relevant. So there's not kind of a, you must have a page of this. It depends on what you've done, but it's nice for you to acknowledge it. And then opportunities for future research. And this might stem directly from the theoretical contributions, right? So some of those great ideas you had about how it could be applied to other areas could now be part of what you're saying for future research. And then this conclusion section, again, please don't just end. Like, I've run out of my 30 pages, I end. No, add in that conclusion paragraph. Let me as a reader go, yes, I really want to think about this more. I really want to do research in this area. It's made me excited about this topic. I now can never think about this topic without thinking about it the way that you stated it in this paper, right? That's what I want to leave with, that feeling. So how can you write the conclusion that allows me to think that way? Next slide.
Okay, if you do all of this, writing the abstract actually becomes relatively easy. So an abstract is a short, less than 200 words, very clear spelling out of what the paper entails. And in fact, it's just largely a scaling down of the key ideas from the paper that signal the contributions and are used to stimulate interest. So the most valuable way I think of starting an abstract is to start with the 5 C's and to write one sentence in relation to each of the 5 C's, and then to wordsmith and figure it out from there. And then in addition to that, you're going to need a title for this paper. You might have had a title from day one, or you might still be trying to figure out a title. And there's various different things you can do to just gain some inspiration there. And the next exercise, or the last exercise that we offer, will help to some extent with that. So this is that exercise. It takes us back to those 5 C's and says, write a sentence in relation to each of these in order to create a first draft of what your abstract's going to look like. And then think a little bit about what the title of the paper is going to be, and you might draw inspiration from prior titles that have sort of grabbed you or captured your attention. Remember that the reader is going to infer quite a lot from your title, and so try and generate some interest in that title and make sure that it makes sense in terms of what the paper is conveying and in terms of what search engines are going to pick up on if this paper ever gets published. The title for the very first version is not going to make or break your paper, so don't not submit because you don't think you've got the title absolutely perfect. Often it gets refined and resolved and elaborated on through the review process. But I've seen people get obsessed with their title to with sort of negative detriment. So, but the critical thing here really is the abstract is quite important in terms of that's what the editor-in-chief, the associate editor, and the reviewers are each going to read first, and it's going to set the tone for what you do from that point onwards. So those are the exercises. And what we're going to do here, just for the last few little minutes, is just talk about going from the exercises, which if you do all of these, you can do them in Word, you can actually complete them and have this foundation of which to work. The challenge then is, how do I go from having done all of that to having a complete first draft? And the key here is using the output from the exercises as a starting point for that first draft. And I can guarantee you it's so much easier to get to a first draft if you've done all these exercises, as opposed to pulling up a blank Word document and saying, okay, now I'm going to start typing. It's like chalk and cheese. So really encourage you to use these exercises such that you can create that first draft and then just work on it. You know, there's that book title, Bird by Anne Lamott, where the idea is that you work on big manuscripts or big writing projects section by section. And you can do that here, just section by section. Work on each of these in whatever order you want, because you've now got the foundations off which to build, and just whatever makes sense for you. And ultimately, I think one of the biggest mistakes that gets made in putting a first draft together is people try and sound too smart, too clever, think it's an academic journal and I need to have a whole lot of academies in there. Just state your ideas simply, convey them in a compelling and clear way, as opposed to trying to be too smart, too clever, or too trying to sound too ingenious in what you're saying. Sherry, anything to add to this one?
No, except that last point, sections should feel connected. So, you know, even though you've done all of these different exercises and you've worked on the different parts of it, make sure that there's a sense of connection throughout it with the use of your language and the use of your voice.
Excellent. And then we'll just go over one more slide, and then we'll wrap it up or allow for questions. So you get to a first draft, and then you want to get to a full submission, and there needs to be some substantial effort and work and energy that happens between that. Too often, especially with some of my earlier stage doctoral students, they think I got a first draft, oh, I just go ahead and submit it. There's a lot of evolution and development that happens from that first draft to submission. So you need to take some time to actually rework things, to see how they're hanging together, to set the paper aside and then come back to it. Share your drafts with others. Ask for feedback, senior colleagues, junior colleagues, anyone who's got a vested interest in your success should be willing to at least read sections of it and provide you with feedback. And it's so valuable to do that without you having to defend what's in there. So you must try and get them to read the paper under the conditions your reviewers are going to be reading it, which is without you to explain what you're trying to do over their shoulder. Present your ideas if you get an opportunity. Talking about them makes a huge difference, at least to me it does. Being able to present your ideas and see how people react. When do they smile? When do they look forward? When do they look puzzled? All of those kinds of feedback mechanisms are excellent. And if you can embed that in the process of getting to a full draft, it can make a huge difference. And then this is a tactic I've found to be incredibly valuable, is reading your own work aloud to yourself. It's torturous, but it's incredibly valuable because other people are hearing your work as they're reading it, and you're able to then partly hear what they're saying. What's even more torturous, get someone else to read it back to you. But that could be beyond the scope. And then make sure you've read over it multiple times, and that it's not just one, that you've set it aside and read over it multiple times. And that should get you to the point of at least having a reasonably strong submission. There's obviously lots lots of other things that can go into that, but this is a great starting point for getting to the point of submitting something valuable to AMR.
The only other thing I would add to this, when it says share your drafts and ask for feedback, we always use the term friendly feedback, but to be honest, you really don't want friendly feedback. You want constructive feedback. You want, ask questions like, what would be the one thing you would take out? Or what is one thing you really didn't like about the paper? It's hard to hear, but sometimes it gives you some of the clarity that you need to really be able to focus on the most crucial points.
So we're going to wrap it up there. There are a few more slides just on the R&R process and some numbers at AMR. And if people want to ask about that, we can answer that. But it's really not the focus of the editorial and not the focus of the session. So we'll open it up now to questions. But before we do, for anyone who needs to drop off, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for participating. And Sherry, do you just want to say a few little things about the way people can be involved in AMR before we actually take questions and allow people to drop off?
Yes, we love having all of your involvement in AMR. You can do this through being an ad hoc reviewer, and then ad hoc reviewers often get to be editorial review board members. If you're wondering, I'm not quite sure that I'm cut out to be an ad hoc reviewer, chances are you are, but we have a bridge reviewer program, which is kind of a stepping stone to get you involved in it. Please look at our website for information about that. And we have the Origin series, which gives you some sense of where ideas come from. You can look on Richard Macadoc's YouTube channel, look up AMR's Origin series, and hear interviews with authors about where their ideas come from and realize it's not so hard to come up with great ideas. They come from lots of cool different places. So thank you. Like Greg said, we really loved having you here, and we look forward to seeing your submissions as well as your involvement in any other way. Thank you. So do we want to go with questions?
Yeah, let's take some questions. Keaton,
Okay.
Nice to see you.
Same here, Professor Fisher. Thank you so much, both Professor Thatcher and Professor Fisher. Unbeknownst to you, my two co-authors are also part of the session, and unbeknownst to you, we've been having a separate email trail where we've been sort of exchanging notes on where we are on each one of the exercises. We have some work to do, but we're also happy to share that. We have a manuscript at this point of time, which we intend to sort of get friendly feedback on, things like that. In fact, we are presenting at the University of Edinburgh conference next month, and we hope to get some good feedback there. One of the things we are struggling with is the discussion section. And so, of course, we want to draw out implications. So this is the entrepreneurship literature. And so one of the things we want to do is draw out implications, not just for entrepreneurship literature, but for organizational theory, management literature in general, as well as practical implications. But we are also aware that through the revision process, that it's going to go through a lot of changes. And so the discussion section itself will change as a part of the review process. And so we're sort of struggling with, I mean, how, of course, you're not striving for perfection. Of course, we want to ensure that this is exciting enough. But right now, we're just struggling in terms of how can we ensure that our discussion section is equally exciting as compared to some of what we think our other sections are. So we were wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll start with a few things, Keaton. The one is that probably more than any of the other sections, writing discussion sections is a craft. It becomes, as Sherry mentioned earlier, I hated it for years. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So for someone who's a junior scholar, it's like, oh, I'll throw up my hands. What must I do? But I'll tell you that the one thing, the one or two things that you can do is write it and then rewrite it and then rewrite it a few times, and always not try and just copy and paste from one to the other, but write it with a fresh perspective. So set it aside, and then, or in your case, I think you've got 3 authors on the paper, get each person to write a version and say, what's really gripping or interesting about this? Part of the reason I encourage my PhD students to write multiple discussions is because it is of all the parts of the paper, it's the part you do certainly get better with practice. So one of the things is don't rush the paper out there too soon, especially if you feel the discussion is undercooked. Give yourself a few chances to rewrite it. And the second thing I've found incredibly valuable is just share the discussion with other authors who are familiar with AMR and maybe familiar with your research to some extent and haven't even read the rest of the paper, because that's a big ask for them to read the whole thing. Just say, look, just read this discussion with me for me and tell me what grips you, tell me what doesn't seem to make sense, tell me what really resonates, or tell me what else I might add in there. And so that's another way of getting feedback in a quicker turnaround and actually getting some input.
Another possibility is, I think, to talk with people that are a little bit outside your area about your idea and see how they interpret it. Because if they may interpret it and go, oh, wow, that relates to my area of expertise in this way, and that gives you some ability to then start talking about your theory in maybe a different way that you had originally intended.
Yeah, my best ideas for discussion sections have come from presenting my ideas to a much more general audience. Yeah. And they're like, well, have you thought about resourcefulness in this way? And I was like, no, but, and then, because then you start to get those parallels that you can draw in that really intrigue a broader audience than just the entrepreneurship set.
Yeah.
That's very useful. And again, with the University of Edinburgh workshop, we are hoping to get some of that general management feedback. But the tip about all 3 of us writing the discussion section, I think that's something we perhaps should try out. So thank you. That's a very useful tip.
Good luck.
Michael.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say thanks for everything that you did here with this presentation, because it applies to all papers, any way you're writing in every area, whether it's theorizing or just writing a conceptual paper. My question is pretty simple. When can you, if you can, state your own opinion in the discussion, of course, but can you? Or, I mean, you're experts. So, I mean, you may be able to, but can a junior scholar or someone that wants to contribute say, and this is how I feel, or just never do it?
I would say that doing that comes with a potential cost, because it tends to, at least in the initial submission, right? You want the reviewers and the associate editors to be on your side. You want them to see what you're building and contributing, and saying something so blatantly like that tends to make our associate editors or reviewers think that you aren't giving enough thought to what's come before you.
Okay.
The one thing I'll just add in there, Michael, I think there are outlets where that is the convention and it's the norm and it's very appropriate to do it. AMR and most more top tier academic journals are not really those outlets. Like, okay. I think as academics, we need to see our opportunities to contribute as broader than just AMR papers, and expressing our own opinion and adding nuance to that and so on can happen in other avenues. But if you want to sort of get through that initial round of reviews and get the reviewers engaged, complying with the convention that this is not an opinion piece is probably pretty important.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
John.
Yes, I think from what I picked up is sort of the assumption that this should be written with your propositions to very quickly become hypotheses that you or someone else is actually going to test empirically. Is that really what you're saying? Is that really the assumption that we make, that we should write on that basis?
No, I don't think that that's what we're saying. I think that that's one style, and some propositions lend themselves to that level of specificity that then others could go and test. But there are also many papers that have developed propositions that are quite difficult to test, that the constructs themselves don't lend themselves to being tested very easily. So I don't think that that's the goal. I think that's one style and one possibility depending on your topic.
A few comments there. I think I actually think if they are immediately testable, you might get pushback that it's too incremental, you're not moving the needle enough, it's not bold enough. Why haven't you just gone and empirically tested it?
Right.
So
yeah.
you almost get yourself into a little bit of a corner by thinking, oh, is this immediately testable? And very often what we find with AMR papers is they actually shine a light on what could be tested in the future. And often that light is broader than what you're going to go and empirically test in a single paper. So a good AMR paper does tend to be a little bolder, more elaborate, and a little sort of, I guess, a little more out there than something that can just be immediately tested. There are examples of propositions that can be immediately tested, but if every single one of your propositions, you can immediately go and find a measure and test it, you're probably going to get pushback that, why don't you just do this empirically anyway?
Yeah. Maria?
I was trying to find my unmute button. Thank you so much for such a wonderful session. And I think that's what makes the scholarly community exciting as well, that we get to have these conversations. So thank you for that. My question is about, as I'm listening to all this discussion, of course, one big part of it is this command over the literature, right? And you have to do so much reading and you have to understand the literature and understand the gaps. So for those of us who are resource constrained and don't have doctoral students and all that, what have you seen in your own work? What has helped you? Like, what are the tools that you use that help you organize the literature review that you do in a way that is useful and can be, the organization that you use that helps you come to those conclusions? So what are the tools that you use?
I mean, Maria, I will say, firstly, this is a totally personal thing. So some of my doctoral students are very good at using electronic tools and so on. This is what I use: a box, or you can't really see it, with index cards. And these index cards have got all my little notes on them. There you sort of get a quick glimpse of them. And I've got boxes and boxes of index cards. And I've got little notes about where they all fit. So I'm like a paper and pen person, and that just happens to be what I am. And it does become easier over time. The more time I spend in this space, it just becomes much quicker, much easier to write a theory background section. And so the one bit of encouragement, the two bits of advice I would give you: find the method that just works for you and is the least friction for you, and stick with it. That's the one bit of advice, because the more you stick with it, the more it's like an exponential effect. The more you contribute, the bigger the payoff you get from the effort you've put in the past. And then, so that's the one bit of advice. And the second bit of advice is just allow time to pass. Like it's more work up front, it's more effort earlier on, but the more you allow time to pass and you continue engaging with it, the bigger the payoffs are down the line. So it's unfortunately just something you've got to stick with in order to get all the benefits from it.
And I think I would also like to add that part of becoming an expert in your area is knowing all this stuff and reading it. And so there aren't any shortcuts in some ways, especially with conceptual papers. I mean, you need to know the literature in and out, whether you're the first author or the fourth author, you should really have a good handle on the literature. So yes, sometimes it's helpful to have students to help you with some of this, but sometimes it actually makes it worse because they may not have done as good a job as you would have done. They may see the literature a little bit differently. They may, miss out on something. So I think it's really important that you have a good understanding of it.
Yeah, I would say almost any AMR author has not outsourced their literature review or keeping up to the literature to someone else. They're doing it themselves, and are investing that time and taking putting in the energy and effort to organize their thoughts and ideas as they evolve. So it's not something you could outsource data collection and some other things, but it's not one of the things that we outsource. Any other questions? Yes, Bertha, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this amazing session. Thank you so much. I've gotten so much out of it. I had two questions. One is very quick, and whether all this also applies to writing a book that focuses on that for those of us who want to go more in depth, And the second one has to do with, I wish we spent a bit more time, but I know you are time constraints, on the phenomenon-based theorizing. I found that interesting, and the distinction you made in the paper, Greg, on inductive and deductive. I think I was working with this mode of where am I with my work right now? I'm working on a book project. Am I doing an inductive? Am I approaching it inductively? Am I doing it deductively? I'm trying to locate. So when I read this, I was like, okay, phenomenon based. I hadn't seen it put this way. So could you say something a bit more, or just is there an article you would ask me to just stay with and that would help me clarify, get that distinction, and then help me name my work, what I'm doing? Am I really phenomenon based, or am I a combination of something? Yeah.
Yeah. The phenomenon based idea is it's something we almost wrote to explore it ourselves. There was this idea that there's these AMR papers that come out that have got like this strong phenomenological grounding. It's like people have seen music in the workplace and said, well, let's go out and find some theory that we can then adopt and adapt and create something new out of it. But it started with the phenomenon. And to be frank, part of the reason I wrote it was because I'm intrigued by it. I'm not necessarily an expert myself. And that's why I wrote it, by going and finding authors who have published those types of papers. So I would argue it's still figuring itself out. This was an initial effort, but I think there'll be more work in terms of figuring out and comparing and contrasting to other types of theorizing. So I don't know that we yet know exactly how to know whether it's phenomenon-based theorizing or not. So it's a bit of an exploration for us. Okay. The other comments I'll make just about the book, because I'm also working on a book right now. Writing a book, I find to be somewhat different. You don't have the space constraints. You don't have this need to very quickly convey the essence of what you're saying. You still want to hook people in, but you've got a lot more opportunity to tell stories, to offer perspectives, to bring in nuance. So I've found I've had to actually adapt quite a bit. And I would say that a lot of the things we're doing here, they can help with the overall structuring of the book. But when you get into the actual writing, it's quite different, quite freeing, quite sort of open. So a lot of the constraints and things that you see in here, you don't need to feel as much under a constraint.
Okay, thank you.
Padin.
Hi, good afternoon, morning. I don't know what time it is in the US, probably morning. Right. Good to meet. I think my question is quite related to what you the point you just raised when you were discussing about whether the authors want to explore the phenomenon, and I was wondering to what extent do the pieces have to come from already published literature versus perhaps other documentary evidences that we can lay our hands on?
So I think if you want to write an AMR paper, you need to, it needs to largely be not only other documentary, not only prior literature, but primarily other theoretical literature or theoretical perspectives. So the phenomenon is from sort of out there, but then you're intertwining it with theory in order to come up with new theoretical explanations of that phenomena. And so certainly the evidence and the things you're drawing from probably need to be from other published literature. You can't go and draw from empirical work you've done in order to justify, or empirical work others have done but haven't published in order to justify what you've got in a phenomenon-based conceptual paper, because there's just not the grounding from which to draw that. And so if you feel like you're being prompted to do that, it's probably better to do an empirical paper yourself.
I would say though that, and this is other documentary or empirical or examples, right? Like using examples and using documentary evidence to illustrate what you're trying to talk about is really important, because if we just talk in the abstract all the time, it's really hard sometimes for our readers to understand us. So bringing in that type of evidence as examples or illustrations can be a very valuable tool, but it's just making it not the primary thing upon which you're basing your theorizing.
Great point. So one of the things I noticed about all those phenomenon-based articles that I interviewed the authors for was almost all of them relied quite extensively on examples they got from somewhere. It could have been from their own research, but it was primarily from media examples or elsewhere. But the examples were to back up and illustrate their theoretical perspective, as opposed to justify that this is the perspective or argue that this is the perspective. And there's a nuanced difference there. Are you using it to illustrate, or are you using it, leading with it to argue? And if you're leading with it to argue, then it should probably be an inductive empirical paper. If you're using it to back up and illustrate, then it really brings life and richness to what you're doing. Okay.
Wonderful. Nasri?
Thank you very much, Dr. Thatcher and Fisher, for this wonderful session. I would like to learn more about the balance between expressing and not expressing opinion. For example, we often hear that we need to, like the junior scholars need to find their own voice and do something original. Then how do we balance our opinion and originality in a paper?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think finding your voice means being able to express something consistently in a way that's true to what you believe, but that doesn't have to be with a strong statement of opinion. And so even some of the words that you often see authors use, like people that write sole author papers often write with the we pronoun to kind of soften the I believe this, and just some of the words that we use, we assert this based on this. And so it suggests that you are having an opinion, but you're basing it or using others' voices that have come before you, or other theory that's existed before you, to help be able to make your voice heard, as opposed to we assert this because it's our view, right? So that's a very different, strong statement that's kind of not giving credit to the other researchers and theoreticians that have come before.
The piece I will add on to that is that I think a big part of finding your own voice is not your own opinion, but offering up a theoretical perspective, insight, or contribution that hasn't yet been offered up. Right. So a big part of your voice is in your contribution, as opposed to just your theorizing is just repeating things that others have said. you've connected those things in interesting ways such that new insights emerge, and that new insight is in essence your voice. So it's not that you're offering up an opinion, you're offering up a new theorization based on what others have said. You're not just repeating what they've said. So for me, that's often where the voice comes, is a big part of finding your own voice is, are you actually contributing beyond what others have said?
Thank you very much. So it's more about the writing style, like instead of saying I believe or I think, that I found or we found, something like that, right?
I found, or I theorize, or based on that argument, this is what I'm going to put forth. So you're using that kind of more grounded perspective as opposed to the more opinionated perspective in your writing style.